So welcome to this third episode, if I can say, or third session of Dynamic Conversations on Organizational Change and Wellbeing. So today I'm very excited because we're going to dive into one of the topic related to this that I'm passionate about, and I think my guest Jessica is as well. So it's about resilience. So it's a reframing how we think about change, less about resistance, more about resilience. So we'll get into this. I'll introduce briefly Jessica Crow. She's joining me today to lead a conversation on resilience and change. Jessica is the founder and the lead consultant at Apogee, which is a change management training consulting company. She's based in the States, and I'm actually Chantal Audet. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder and owner, lead consultant, trainer at Alive Aware Daring. My business is located in Canada, but I currently live in France. So it's interesting. We'll be covering having people today joining us from, North America, Europe, and even, Australia and New Zealand, which is interesting. So the way it's going to work today is as we did for the last two sessions, we'll have some guiding questions to kind of get us, to address some of the core elements we want to make sure that we discuss with you. We have 3 of those questions that I've shared in advance. 2 for sure we'll cover today, and hopefully you'll contribute, your observations, experience, questions, ideas. The third one, if we don't get to it, I think we can address, after the session. So again, for those who just joined, this session is recorded and is going to be shared on replay on YouTube, on my channel. The first 60 minutes only is going to be recorded, or 60 minutes or so the core of the conversation. But you're welcome to stay after for an informal chat if you want and have additional, ideas that you want to share and discuss. So let me first, so Jessica and I will first introduce why we wanted to discuss this and share our thoughts about this with you, and then we'll get going with the first question. So first, the importance of resilience for me, as it relates to change, is in my experience over the years leading change or facilitating change in organization, one of the key things I've noticed is, and you all know this by now, is change is stressful. And so if you want people to be able to face and adapt to change, they need some resilience. And as resilience is defined by the American Psychological Association as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and significant sources of stress. The issue I find is, nowadays, yes, there are times where stress is pretty significant, and so we need people to have the capacity to adapt to that. But in organization, I think more and more, because of all the stresses people experience, their workload and the demands placed on them, it doesn't take a lot of stress for people to be needing resilience to face it. So basically, the stress threshold is pretty low in general. I think you all experienced that, right? Especially in the last 2 or 3 years with everything that's happening in the world. So when we think about resilience, I go a little bit beyond this definition. It doesn't have to be significant. It has to do with how you experience the stress. If it's challenging you, if it's requiring your capacity to adapt, then you need resilience. And so what's behind resilience for me is is capacity. So you need energy, you need to have the resources, right, to adapt. And when we think of change, sometimes the way we design organizational change, we don't really consider that people's capacity will vary over time. And so we need to rethink how we think about change, so that we design the change in a way where we acknowledge that people need downtime, they need recovery time. Like, it's one thing to face stress, but resilience really happens after, when we recover. Like, we face the stress and then we are able to recover and move on and face another stress. So if we don't allow that time for people to recharge, integrate, and recover, then there's no way they're going to be able to adapt, to learn. And so what we see, if we push, more change, and we don't allow for a proper recovery capacity, energy diminishes, then more difficulty for people to learn. They end up having negative outlook on, what's going on. They lack motivation, and all of this lead us to think they're resisting, right? So resistance is basically two things for me. It's the initial reaction that's normal for when people, face something new, unfamiliar, challenging. So they need to acknowledge that this is normal, a reaction, a normal feeling related to the stress response. But then if they can't adapt, they can't participate, if they push back, that's because they don't have enough capacity. And so they don't have the resilience to keep, facing more and more stresses. Before I turn on to Jess for the, share our initial thoughts on that, I just want to share that all of this, when I talk about stress and resilience, I'm not talking about, removing stress from people, because the other thing we know is we need stress. We need to be challenged to actually pay attention, to learn, to grow, and, and change. So we need stress, but to build resilience to be able to face that change and actually learn from it, we need the recovery, we need the capacity, we need the energy. So we need to balance both, right? We need to face that stress to build the resilience and adapt and change. So that's why it's very core to me. So I'm very excited to be able to dive into this. So Jessica, tell me why this topic is really appealing for you, because I think you're also very, passionate about this in your own approach to organizational change.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, thank you for having me be a part of this conversation. It's really cool that there's so many different countries represented on the call. That's really exciting. So I am happy to be here to not only share my perspectives, but learn from everyone. So again, my name is Jessica Crow. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. So I might be, anybody else representing the USA? Just me? Okay, cool. This is a very important topic to me. So prior to starting Apogee, which is my change management training and consulting firm, I had spent almost 16, 17 years working in a corporate setting in a variety of roles. And part of my job was to lead and implement change. I was in the role of the impacted stakeholder. I was somebody who was driving the change. I had, change management training. And what I really realized over time, no matter what role I was in, that there was something missing from how we were implementing change in the organization, because what we were seeing was we'd roll out a change, it'd last for a little bit of time, and then people would go back to their former behaviors because there was too much change happening. The way that we were rolling it out was not considering the well-being of our employees. So you mentioned, Chantal, the need for that rest and recovery. And in the corporate world, that go, go, go mentality, focus on results, was really impacting how and influencing how we implemented our strategy. And so prior to the pandemic, the global epidemic was stress, and it still is stress. And I think today there's more awareness of the need to factor in well-being and resilience and how that influences our readiness as human beings and as employees. And I myself experienced burnout and didn't even know what it was at the time. I just knew I was very unhappy. I was tired all the time. I wasn't motivated to do the work. So when I left the corporate world and started my firm, I wanted well-being and resilience to be a focus of how we led, taught, and implemented change in an organization. So when I think about resilience, it's everything that you said. And it's so much more than that, because we bring our whole selves to work. So it's really being mindful of the human experience, that we can't shut off everything that's happening outside of the workplace when we come into the office. And yes, we need to be professional and manage appropriately, but at the same time, there has to be other elements of our culture, our corporate cultures, that our business cultures, our community cultures that support and encourage more, wellness, well-being, and resilient behaviors. And that will get more done if we actually are honoring those cycles and rhythms. So that's why it's really important to me.
That's great. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure everybody who's joining a call today agree that, tackling resilience or addressing resilience as part of supporting organizational change is important. So Mala, we're going to dive into what we can actually do to incorporate resilience in our change management plan. So I think that was the first question, right? How do we integrate resilience into implementation strategies and plans. So as we start planning for a change in organization, how can we consider, like, integrate that? So what do you think, Jessica? Because I know you wrote a little bit about this. So
Yeah.
what would be
Well, maybe I
two
can
or three
start
things
with a
you would
quick question for the group, actually. How many of you on the call, your role is change management professional? You're focused on change and innovation, or like maybe in the chat, or if you feel free sharing, what's your role? Go ahead.
Yes, John.
Oh, you might be on mute still, John. Oh, there we go.
Well, I think we can hear him now.
So I own my own business, but I third party to one of the big consulting firms here in Canada, and I lead change initiatives, large scale, mid market, usually ERP related.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am intrigued by this because there's literally one client I've worked with where we're on our year 4 of an ERP implementation. And so how do we stay resilient despite all the things, Chantal, that you mentioned of, that we need time off, we need to recharge and re-energize. And I know myself, I'm finding it hard. I'm looking forward because this is literally my last event before the holidays. But how do we do that in terms of these large scale, long-term transformations that some of our clients might be doing?
Yep. Thanks, John.
Mm-hmm. And I think we had Joe had raised his hand, right?
Oh yeah. Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So yeah, my name is Joe. I'm a business change manager from SoCal Gas out in Los Angeles, California. So yeah, our current organization, we're dealing with a lot of changes. So it affects many different projects in terms of change saturation and people's abilities to embrace change and their capacity. As soon as one project is implemented, we move on to the next one, and there's really like no recovery time. So
right.
Some of the things we're trying to explore in terms of managing that change saturation is possibly slowing down the amount of change that's happening throughout the organizations, or trying to address this with some form of like heat mapping, so we could try to address the capacity for these different groups that are embracing these or adopting these new changes. So that's some of the things we're trying to explore, but definitely open to hear different approaches.
Yep. Great. Thank you for sharing that.
And hello, I'm Gregor. I'm from New Zealand, so nice to interact with people from all around the world at early in the morning or whatever time it is. So the problems appear the same. I work in a change management world as a contractor, so always across organisations that are busy, a lot of activity, and facing change in a number of directions. As John said, I'm working with an organisation that's got an ERP implementation at the same time as they've got a large technology transformation. And I guess the layers of change that impact on the same people, often mid-level managers, people leaders, people who are having to go through that challenge to learn new behaviours, to learn new systems. It for them, it just seems ongoing. It's just standing at the beach and the waves just keep coming. And some of them self-select and depart, or some of them weather it and they learn and they grow, or some of them get tired, unhappy, all of those words that you mentioned before. So I'm keen to come and participate and learn some other strategies that people may be using to help those people through that, because that's our job. We help them through, to get through that and be well.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
That's great. So what would you like to share, Jessica, based on that?
Yeah, I mean, these are clearly, we are all experiencing very similar dynamics in our workplaces. I have a client who is oil and gas, and they're implementing an HCM, and they've been implementing ERP for quite some time, and people are feeling that. So definitely what everyone has said has resonated. The way that I think about resilience is in two sort of buckets. One, it's that human empathy, compassion, subtle changes in terms of conversation and interactions that can have a really meaningful impact, positive impact. And then it's some practical, tactical, how do we change the way that we operate the approach? And so I categorize it in two ways, because the softer side is, I find that to be more difficult for people to implement, actually, because, you know, you're working with a company that's rolling out a technology change, and maybe they don't seem like they would be open to this. I think what I have found is people want to be seen, they want to feel heard, and they want to feel cared for. And some very simple ways to do that, kind of the biggest opportunity, is to bring awareness to this topic. So if this isn't a part of the conversation, that's step one, is recognizing that employee well-being has a direct impact on their readiness to change, their ability to accept, adopt, and sustain the changes, because change, you know, as we all know, if it's not sustained by an organization, it doesn't add any value, even those changes that are required. So for example, you're rolling out an ERP or an HCM or whatever it is, it's going to happen. But what will happen along the way, if you're not thinking about the well-being, the resilience of the end users, is you leave, you know, a trail of bodies, so to speak, how Gregor explained it. Some people might leave, some people might stay and withstand it, some people might end up being sad and burnt out, and all the words that I used earlier. So creating conversation around that is step one. And then as change leaders, things that we can do that are surprisingly simple but incredibly effective are creating space for people to express how they are feeling, their fears, their concerns, what keeps them up at night. Now, you may not have the solution to their problems or their concerns, but simply being able to talk about them in a group setting, in fact, is really, really meaningful. So here's an example. When I started with my oil and gas client, one of the bits of feedback I received prior to that engagement was they're cowboys and girls, and they just really want to, you know, get down to business. And when I entered this group meeting, we had this meeting to plan, it started off really full of tension and full of angst, because the change was happening and the end users didn't have a say in what was happening, and they were feeling burnt out from the previous change, which went really, really poorly. So I kind of went rogue, so to speak, and hit pause on the meeting and hit pause on the planning and just said, hey, you know, there's been a lot of change that's happened. Let's talk about, like, how are you feeling today, and what isn't working for you, and creating that space for that conversation. We spent an hour and a half of people just sharing how they were feeling, what they didn't like, what they did like, what they were looking forward to. Now, you have to be able to facilitate and guide the session and create and time box it in many ways, but giving people that space is incredibly therapeutic in many ways. And just getting it out there almost clears the way to move forward in a different way. So if you have a project team, or you're bringing together stakeholders to think about how to create the change plans and implement the change, create space in the conversation for people to share what their concerns are. That is step one. That's that self-reflection activity. Other ways to invite resilience in from that softer skills is really getting to know people and connect on a personal level. So that social connection, building networks of and facilitating interpersonal relationships, especially in today's distributed environment, is so important, because we're disconnected. We're looking at each other through screens. Even people who are in the same office, a lack of personal connection leads to a lack of trust. And when there's a lack of trust in an organization, the way that we make choices and decisions ends up being as a means of survival and about, preserving what we have versus being for the greater good. So if we're talking about how do we, Joe mentioned, how do we slow things down? How do we create this space for people to absorb and rest and be able to recover? It's getting to know people and developing those relationships so people trust each other more. And so when somebody says we need to take a pause here, they actually, you listen and you take action in a different way. There's other practical things you can do too, but I'm going to pause before we get to that part. But have any of you tried incorporating some of that softer, like let's human to human get to know each other and talk about this?
So I just put in the chat, I'm a Dale Carnegie trainer as well, which is all about relationships, as you know.
Yeah.
And I've tried this, and the company that I work for, actually, you're spending too much time on this, on the relationship and the fluffy stuff. Interestingly enough, though, the clients that I work with, that's absolutely what they're asking for and what they want and what they crave. You know,
I
we
love
don't earn the right, as Dale Carnegie says, to influence or ask for cooperation, or certainly to lead until we've built a relationship. So I do my best within the parameters I'm given with the company I work with.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I find that the way I look at it I totally agree with what you just shared, Jessica, about, you know, the need for conversations, creating space and having people to be able to share, you know, how they feel, the concerns, and connect as well and build those relationships. And the way I look at it when it relates to resilience, resilience is really, as I said, a question of capacity and energy. And a lot of the things that are draining our energy is this noise, I would say, in the background, is all the fears. Like if we're in a fear state, right? And that's often driven by, you know, what people are going to think about us. Are we doing well? Like, you know, we fear judgment, we fear, you know, different things. So if we are able to build this climate of trust, right, where people feel psychologically safe, they can open up, support one another, they feel they are in this together. From that perspective, we're going to be able to reduce a little bit of that noise that's draining energy, right? And so if we can help people get out of this fear state, I would say, because, you know, when we use stress and facing challenge, yes, you have a stress response in your body, but you don't have to get caught up in a fear response in your head, right? If you feel supported, if you feel the work is meaningful, if you feel like you can raise, you know, a concern if you have one, if you can ask questions, if you can admit that you don't know, for example, all these things, right? We just mentioned. And I find one of the things that can help in this dynamic of building resilience as well. And so not only reducing the fear and creating trust, but it's changing the language, right? Using language like we, right? When we talk about this change, it's we, it's the project team, the people, everybody's involved, it's we are in it together, for example. And those conversations will help build that sense that we're in this together if we use the proper language. So Natalie, if you want to share something.
Hi, everybody. I work for Canada's Federal Bank and Insurance Regulator, and worked in the Learning and Development Department for many, many years here, but just recently moved to our transformation office because we are undergoing a significant change and transformation, particularly on the culture side, but several other initiatives that, you know, it's that lots of change going on at one time. And so listening in this conversation, I'm a bit, I don't know, feeling a bit validated, I think, because my role in that transformation office is in what we call our community building group. So me and my director, our sole purpose is to identify communities that need support. How do we help them and empower them? How do we bring them together so they can support one another? And it is very much heavily based on building relationships so that, you know, they can weather and navigate the transformation together. So I think what I'm hearing is that that's probably a very good thing. But I also, you know, we have our work cut out for us because it's a bit of a different way of working for this organization. So I just wanted to share, but this is cool.
That's great.
This is great. See, we all benefit from having that space to share and get support from one another. That's great. So we covered a little bit of the soft side. I have one additional thing I want to share before maybe we address more, maybe if you want, Jessica, the strategic, you know, tactical aspect.
Yeah.
So you touch on, you know, well-being and raising awareness. One thing I find that may be useful is to incorporate in how we interact and engage people is some component of either resilience training or resilience in the sense like helping people understand how to manage their stress response, because when you're dealing with change, right, you have a stress response. And so being aware of that, you know, what's resistance you're feeling, how to manage a stress response. That, or it could be in addition, you know, some knowledge around the growth mindset as well. Right? These are, if you have a greater awareness of those things, like how it's okay to experiment and fail, and you can learn from it, and it's okay. You know, it helps people better, I guess, interpret how they're feeling and be able to voice, you know, where they situate themselves in this. I find that can help, because when we talk about resilience, I think in the workplace, it's more mental and emotional resilience. So we really need those tools as well of, understanding emotions and how we react to what's going on. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. And I actually think, not just resilience as it relates to change stress. I mean, I would imagine most people have a degree of stress no matter what, right? Like work, home, life in general. And so, yeah, John just put, I've incorporated mindfulness exercises into what he's doing. That's great. And I think those are opportunities to educate and inform the entire organization and not just those impacted by the change. The challenge that I run into or have in the past, and it's definitely shifting because of the influence of the pandemic on employees and of course all of us as humans, but there's more awareness at the C-suite level. And in the past, I don't think this conversation of resilience and the soft side and how we do this was as accepted. But what I'm seeing now, if we're going to go from here are the conversations you can have, here's how we incorporate relationship building, the topic of resilience is really top of mind for the C-suite because they are seeing that play out in the attrition, the retention of their workers, what people care about in their employee, surveys where they're saying, I'm not fulfilled by the work that I'm doing. I'm not, or I'm leaving because of whatever reason. And so the dots are being connected in many ways. And it's really our responsibility helping our stakeholders through the transition to connect the dots even further from what we can do on the soft side to pulling the data, at the organization level to linking it to how this impacts their ability to accept, adopt, and sustain change. And so, yeah, so with the softer stuff, I think that, and I call it soft, it's really just human skills, right? Like, let's be good people and do the right thing by people because that is what we should be doing. The more kind of strategic, I'm saying not practical, things that you can do operationally in terms of incorporating resilience into your change management strategies and plans. And Joe had mentioned this too with his heat mapping, where you're identifying where your stakeholders are being affected, which stakeholders will be adopted. So one thing that I've done in the past, it was a global healthcare company, and we were continuously rolling out changes to our frontline workers. They were caregivers in dialysis centers, and we were wanting them to implement a process change, a new technology, all these different things. And we were finding that the stickiness of the changes was incredibly variable depending on the center for a lot of different reasons. And there were some factors that we could control, and there were some factors that we couldn't control. What we did to support our employees in those locations and all of our dialysis centers was take a step back and do what Joe described and look at what roles are we impacting, and we started to rate and rank the changes that we were rolling out according to a new set of criteria. And yes, cost to implement and ROI were still a part of those conversations, but the conversation around likelihood for success, our employees feeling supported, do they have the resources? Those were things we started to do. Today, those factors could be expanded to include stress level, trust level, other things that could influence and support the well-being of the employees that are being impacted by the changes. So you could rate, rank, prioritize, and roll out those changes that really offered the most value to all of the stakeholders that are impacted. So that's one example of how you can operationalize something within the organization to either slow down or create space for that rest and recovery, which is what you need in order to develop resilience and therefore in the long term be ready for the next set of changes. So that's one example. I'd love to hear what other people are doing.
Well, we have Joe share that they've conducted a readiness assessment as a therapeutic space, and that helped people become more cooperative after expressing their needs. So that's great.
Very cool.
I would say the heat map for just mapping and looking across different projects and change happening at the same time, it's like that's the fundamental, but it's so difficult and resource intensive for an organization to have those conversations. But more and more organizations are doing this, and I think it's very important to think about include, as you said, some metrics around how people feel in this, like what's the resources they have, the capacity they have at that moment. Because we can talk about resilience. Take the most resilient person. If you drop on this person 10 changes at the same time, while they're also like in a busy time of the year delivering their day-to-day job,
Right.
Resilience is questions of, how can you adapt based on capacity you have at that moment? So it's a questions of demands versus capacity. So we need to kind of match what we're imposing on people, I guess, to their capacity at that moment. That being said, so that's one thing. So we manage the demands we put on them so that we make sure they have more capacity to handle. Another way to look at it, I find, is, so we were talking about recovery time, and when a project is lasting very long or it's very time intensive, like in terms of like it may not be lasting very long, but it's very high pressure to deliver in the short term. So in all these cases, there's lots of pressure, right? It's, as Gregor said, it's hard to slow down, to just take a break, and because you just keep pushing and pushing. One way we can look at it is not necessarily taking like long breaks or that you need to have like time off. It's really about the way we think about pacing. So because we tend to think of productivity as we just go, 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 go. But I think of it more as on and off. So sprint, work hard, recover. Sprint, work hard, recover. And so when one analogy we can think of is in the physical world, like when we train our muscles, the more harder we work, the longer the recovery, right? But not necessarily. You can work super hard for just 10, 15 minutes. You take the day off, you have a good night's sleep. The next day, your muscles are already stronger, right? So we don't, but if you do the opposite and you just train your muscle, push them all day long, and you don't recover, the next day, you won't be able to do anything with it, right? So it's a question of intensity. So I was thinking about it, how do we integrate that mentality of pacing, right? Alternating between high intensity recovering. There's different things. The first one I would say is thinking of the analogy of building muscles is deliver the change in gradual small chunks. So you deliver more of the chunks. So you ask people to be involved and learn and adapt, but in chunks at the time. And so we cycle like, okay, let's do this and then step back. We'll come back and learn more. And so you build the capacity over time. So because it's done gradually, they also get familiar gradually. So they reduce the fear and the stress response, right, to the unknown. The other aspect related to that is as you deliver in small chunks, as much as we can, right, with the change, it's almost like you invite people to get into action. And when we invite people to act and be involved and participate and do something with their hands and body, or just, with their head, but really physically doing something, then they get out of their head and in their body, and that reduces the stress response. Because the anxiety people feel that's draining their energy and making them resistant in the first place is usually their mind just spinning, right? They worry about all the things coming up and they try to figure out what's going on. So one way to deal with this is, yes, these conversations and safe space to process that. But the other way is to get into action, right? Channel that stress, that energy into experimenting, trying out, learning small chunks, and then recovering, and then coming back, right? It's not necessarily easy to do in all change, but if you deliberate as you plan for the work, and people will do better if they participate, if they're involved in gradual steps, then you can build a resilience as you go, and you can also learn from them as you go. And I would say, and just to finish on that, and then I'll turn over to you, Jessica, you can start with the project team itself. And so one way to do it is, I know Agile does that to some extent. So if you're in Agile framework, you do sprints. Usually if it's done well, you determine what you're going to do. You work super hard for 3 weeks. Then you stop, reassess, realign, come back. And so that's the pause you need, right? And I say when it's done well, because there's so much pressure that people tend to squeeze that week or those few days a little bit too short. But if it's done well, after the sprint, you're going to have a break. You're going to come together with the team and, breathe out, exhale, assess, connect, have fun, and then replan and go again, right? And so if you do this with a project team, you don't have to do an Agile framework. You can just plan to deliver the work in cycles like this, month by month. Let's say we're going to focus for the next 3 weeks and a half. This is where we're going to deliver. Let's go. We'll push. Obviously, there are micro cycles you need to manage in this. And then at the end, you celebrate, you take a breather, sorry. I need to take a breath. Yeah. And, when you do this, you create the connections, you create the space, you allow for the time to excel, as I said, but also to learn, integrate, reassess, and go again. And when you do this as well, the other thing is you take a time to look back and say, wow, what we've done so far. Right? Because otherwise we're just keep the focus on what's else to do, the work that's left to be done, how far the journey is yet to be traveled. But if we take a little pause like this together and celebrate what's been accomplished, you kind of tap into this dopamine, right, rush that you need. It's like, wow, we feel like we're moving forward. That's great. Let's continue. Anyway, so I'm just going to stop on that. I get very excited when I talk about all these things. But so what do you think, Jessica? What are the other things?
I totally agree with you. And I love how you've incorporated exercise science and the analogy with muscle, like developing muscle. If you keep going, it's not going to be as effective. You could get injured, a lot of things. So I think it's a really great parallel with both, if you have an agile framework, the analogy with the muscle, very, very good. I'm totally on board with that. I think that, the challenge that we have is that that type of pacing isn't persistent in how companies operate. There's maybe pockets of the organization that might have that methodology and approach or thinking. And it's how do we do this at scale? How do we invite and encourage this type of, behavior change, thinking change? And it really has a lot to do with how do we transform the culture of the organization? So I feel like that's a big opportunity for all of us as change leaders of projects and programs to start thinking about how what we're doing can contribute to culture change in addition to implementing the changes that we're rolling out. And, I don't have the silver bullet for that by any means, but just starting to talk about it and creating those parallels and using storytelling and examples and sharing that with senior leaders and decision makers in the organization is really important part of what we do. And obviously, we report out on project progress and change, results, et cetera. But how do we start to, you mentioned change the language earlier. How do we start to incorporate those components into the ways that we're communicating the success or the I'll say failures, but it's more like the issues that are being presented as a result of how we are working and how we're implementing change. Any ideas from the group on things you've tried in the past that have either succeeded or failed as it relates to the conversation around how do you share how the resilience of impacted stakeholders? Has that happened for you or not yet? Not yet.
We've tried it via the heat map. We've tried it, via, as Chantal said, during that week off from the sprints. But my experience tells me that when you get in full flight of the program, that time gets taken up with other things. The heat map kind of gets lost in there. So I'm still working through how it becomes a priority, I guess, for the project leadership and others.
Yeah, I find that it's I think you just mentioned there's a cultural aspect, right? So all the things we're talking today, and that's why we wanted to create a space in the first place, right? They're not part of the culture right now. But I find the challenge we have when we work with one project or we're leading one change is we cannot take on the entire culture change on our shoulders. That being said, we have a space where, because it's time defined, it's a scope defined space, and it's meant to be creating something new, that we have an actual space to experiment new ways of working. So that's why I suggest, sometimes starting with the project team itself, if the leader is open to it, to just try different ways of doing things. And as I was saying, how it's making a difference. And I understand that if you talk about resilience, people will say, well, we're busy, we have work to do, but just linking it back to productivity, will help, right? Especially if we think about the long term. How are you going to continue this sprint, this survival mode for 4 years, for example? There's no way you can do that. Like, even if your personal lives, if you're working on a very long-term project, you need pacing, you need strategy. Yes, keeping an eye on the goal, the reason why you're doing it, but you need a support system, you need the pacing, and you need to be able to see milestones and feeling like you're moving forward and making progress. Yes, Natalie.
Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
Sorry.
I think when I think of our own organization, I definitely think there's some benefits to being a government organization, because I've worked in both private and public, and I think part of government's mandate is to look out for their employees and look after their employees, right? So the climate is definitely different. So I appreciate that in this conversation. But I also think there's, I don't know what to call it. I think there's a credibility piece in there. So we as an organization, I don't try to do this quickly, I don't take it too much time.
That's good.
Canada weathered the last financial crisis quite well, and actually very well. And that had a part of that was due to the work of the organization that I work for. So when I say credibility, I mean the organization internally has credibility with its senior leaders, because we're a very high performing organization. And so when we started this transformation that we're currently in now, we had a new superintendent. We were guns a-blazing. He felt the need for change internally, so he pressed with it. And then everybody kind of went, wait a minute, like, we have all this core work to do. We're just coming out of a pandemic. We can't do this. And he listened, and our senior leadership listened, because we have a good track record, and we're not. Look, we have a lot of whiners, so don't get me wrong, we're not perfect by any stretch. We have a lot of change resistors, like, it's huge, but our track record of performance is strong. And so I think that track record ahead of time gives EC comfort when the organization says, wait a minute, we need to slow down. And that's exactly what we did. So I just think that's interesting. Like, how can you position the workforce to be credible and listened to by your senior management? I think that's what I'm trying to convey. The other thing is, one of our senior leaders in particular, she is a huge advocate for well-being. And so we all know, senior leaders that walk the talk make all the difference in the world. And so even throughout the pandemic, it was very much look after yourself. This is reminders. And more importantly, our senior leadership demonstrates the behaviors we're asking our staff to do. So, it's a lucky situation. It's a neat, fortunate environment to be in. But I think I just wanted to share, because it's like, it's working. It's working for us, right? So
I think the point though about building credibility, and Chantal, you mentioned that you can start with the project team and you can't necessarily take on culture change for the organization. I sort of think of it as one and the same, right? Like, if not you, then who? Yes, it starts with building credibility, which means doing the work, doing it well. At the same time, it means incorporating those things that we know would be meaningful with the project team, and seeing how that can cascade or influence the decision-making of other teams. So for example, if you have a project that you're rolling out, it's a multi-year project. Some things that we've done, or that I've done with clients in the past, is to maintain some of that resilience and sustainability, is rotating out your change agents, your change champions, your influencers, however you refer to them in the organization. Those individuals that are being tapped because of their subject matter expertise or their relationships, making it a short-term assignment, giving them that break, and then positioning the opportunity to serve as a change lead as a development opportunity. Learning and development is such a great way to give back to your employees, create some loyalty, and develop some resilience along the way. Learning new skills, that growth opportunity, that's where you develop resilience and learning. So rotating out your change influencers, positioning those roles as short-term leadership development opportunities, that's been very successful with a few of the clients that I'm working with, because then it becomes exciting. Now, as the change lead who's on the multi-year project, you'll have to think about ways to keep it fresh for yourself, but for the stakeholders that you are guiding and the structure that you're creating. That's one way to do that. In terms of how you look at measurement and metrics, start to track stress level, stress factor, get that pulse check from your employees. How are you, month by month with the project? Then you can take a look at the types of projects that are being rolled out across the organization, the stakeholders that are being impacted. Start to measure trust, commitment, trust in leadership, commitment to the organization. Yeah, those are things that you can do from a measurement. And so when you start to report out on that to your peers, to the project team, to the leadership team, you may not be driving the entire culture change, but you're planting those seeds. And that's really all that you can do. And, that's really all you can do. But you'll start to get, people will take notice. It'll start to be seen, felt, because, if you've got a small team, like Natalie said, who's doing the right things, they're building that credibility, they're building that trust with others, then people will notice. You might, find your allies, like the executive who cared a lot about well-being. Those individuals will start to come out of, we'll say, the cracks and say, hey, I like what's happening here. This feels right. I'm going to be along for the ride. I'm going to support this. I'll be a sponsor. So you'll start to see that happen. So I always think about that Mahatma Gandhi quote, be the change you want to see in the world. And it really does start with us taking, action
totally agree
on what we know to be right.
Yeah. And so when I said we cannot take on the entire cultural change, I totally agree. It has to start small and we can do a difference there. I find that sometimes when I work with clients is we were talking just before the conversation started with everybody, that we need to integrate change management and project management. And I find when project management, usually there's a defined scope and, resources. And so when you work with project leaders, they're very careful not to take on things that don't belong to them, because there's already limited resources and time and capacity to just deliver what's in the scope. But when we deal with change, we deal with bigger than just what's part of the project delivery, right? It's how people are going to receive those deliverables. It's how they feel and how they're going to integrate this. So we have to look beyond that. And that includes people's well-being. It's not just, do they have the skills and the knowledge to use the new technology, right? It's how they feel. Are they in the right space to actually learn? Are they ready because of all the other things that are happening to actually receive the change? And so when we get into this, sometimes I get pushed back to say, well, it's not in our scope, right? So one way I think now, based on our conversation, where we can bring some add credibility to what we're talking about, is really testing, experimenting, and showing the difference it makes in delivering, right? In being productive and delivering on the project. So having metrics will help with for sure, right? To say, yes, we experiment, but if we can demonstrate it's actually changing not only how people feel, but how well they deliver and how much the project is actually progressing and not slowing down or facing hurdles, right? So that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you can link those outcomes too to, other bottom line metrics as well, which is the key, I think, to be able to connect all of those dots.
So before we get to maybe talk about a little bit of the measures and how do we measure resilience, I have a few things we can share, but one thing I'd like to also throw in there, I mentioned earlier, we're dealing mostly with mental and emotional resilience, right, at work, because most of the work we do is mental. I mean, there are, workspaces, I understand in some project that requires people physically doing work, but usually with change, it's about the capacity to integrate mentally and also deal with your emotions. But I find that if we want to increase resilience in people, we need to look at their physical health as well. For two reasons. The first one, as I said, if they don't sleep well, they don't integrate, they don't recharge, they're not ready to go the next day. So helping people have a healthy lifestyle or helping them with their sleep patterns may help. The first thing. The second one is, if you build your physical fitness, your physical resilience, right, it also helps with the other dimensions, right? Because when you work hard and train, you have more energy, more capacity to actually handle the load on a mental and emotional level. And you also, as you go and push yourself to physically build your physical resilience, you learn, how to deal with that capacity and how to push the threshold a little bit higher. You know what it looks like to actually build that resilience physically. And so you can relate more easily to how to build that resilience mentally and emotionally as well. But it's hard to tell people how you should exercise and sleep well. But if you create a space for conversations and hear about people's concerns and how they feel, these can be part of conversations where you just invite people to share how they recover from the stress of the day, how they manage their stress and all these things, and maybe invite someone, an expert in a conversation, to share some tips on that. But if it's valued, if it's modeled by the leaders, it really helps. So all that to say that we shouldn't neglect the physical aspect, because that's where it starts, right? When you think of a capacity or energy, I think of it of 4 batteries, and one of them is physical. The other 2 are, as I said, mental, emotional, and there's also a spiritual purpose, dimension. If you can tap into that one as well, the purpose, the meaning, and the sense, as you said, that if you're in part of this project and invested as a learning and development, contributing to organization, then you have this drive, this additional energy, and then resilience, right, to face the change. Anybody
I completely
has
agree with you.
Yeah. Anybody else has something to share on different ways we can plan or integrate resilience into our change approach? Or as one of the other questions is about more the different choices we can make about our interventions and resources to care for the human side of change and develop resilience. Anything you've tried so far? Or maybe Jessica, if you want to share additional thoughts.
I can kick it off. I'd love to hear what other people have tried. I mean, so this actually builds on the what you were talking about, physical activity and exertion, creating space. So having meetings end 5 minutes before the end of the hour. There's this framework that I think of, it's M3, movement, meditation, mindset. So creating space for movement breaks within the day, making it a cultural norm that there's time, people have breaks between one meeting to the next, so they can get up, move, do some breath work, whatever it is. You mentioned modeling the behaviors, starting meetings with self-reflection or some mindfulness or breath work to really give people that chance to let go of the meeting they were just in and focus on the meeting they're currently in. And then some of the mindset piece comes in the context of the coaching, right? Teaching our leaders and managers how coaching skills so they can be more effective at guiding their teams through periods of change and transformation or difficulty. There's a lot of leaders and organizations who step into that role because they've been very strong individual contributors, and their results have got them there, but what got them there won't necessarily make them effective leaders. And so teaching them how to use coaching skills to have different types of conversations with employees is a great way to invite resilience into the space. So those are some things that I've done in the past that have been really effective. I know it sounds very simple, but they have a big impact.
Yeah, there's some. Yes, go ahead, Gregor.
Same. I mean, I can only ever affect so many people, and the change we're dealing with at the moment is distributed geographically throughout the country. So I can get the managers together, but they've got to go back and lead their people. And so coaching them, giving them some skills, just small bites. Go back and continue to do this. Those leaders, they want to do a good job, but often they haven't been equipped to do that. They've been really good individual contributors. They've been stepped up. They're busy. And if somebody said to them, just go back and do this, talk to your people, build that trust, accept the failures in there as you experiment. It's okay, so long as it's safe. But giving them the freedom to go back and the support to do that, and then just checking in with them. So getting them together face to face is incredibly challenging. So being able to just continuously know, you can call me 0800 phone a friend, and we can have a conversation about what's working. It helps them not be isolated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a key one. And I find that, as you said, helping them, supporting them, being there as a change lead, management lead or the person responsible for the change, being there to support them is good. In addition, what I found is very useful is creating a space where they can also learn from one another and share at this level. So And it has to be created, because otherwise they will never find the time. But if you, create that space, that time where you come in and they'll know you'll have something to share with them, and you're going to facilitate a conversation between them to do that. Over time, they build those relationships. They have a space where they can realize that they're not alone in facing certain challenges. They can really learn, like, okay, this is how you've done. Okay, that's great, right? That they learn from one another. But if you leave them alone to do this, they're too busy, right? They won't do it. But if you create the space, they may complain at first to find the time, but as soon as they'll experience it, they will value that space so much, and the support from their peers, and as well from the lead of the change, because it's an outside perspective, someone who can coach them with the right questions, facilitate that conversations, and just feeling heard, right, and seen. That's great. So you mentioned, Jessica, movement, meditation, mindset, and that leads me back to the introduction on what I said. We talk about resistance versus resilience, and it's all related to how we handle stress, right? And I find those things like movement and meditation, although they're not directly related to work activities, they're two good ways to release the stress. Like movement is a good way to release the stress. Meditation helps you become more, or mindfulness activities, like John said, they help you become more aware of your stress response and reaction. And so you can create a space to actually choose what you need to do in this moment to respond to what's going on. Otherwise, I find, people get into stress mode, overdrive, survival, and that's a space where if you're not aware that you're in this mode, you just go and push, you become defensive, you're not open, you judge, and all these reactions that we call resistance, right? Even if you're not aware of it, you may say, hey, I'm not resisting change, but I'm so stressed out and busy that I'm pushing back all the time, I'm questioning everything, or procrastinate. That's another another symptoms of being too anxious, right? There's so much tension and worry that you just don't get into action. You just wait until it's too late.
Yeah.
Almost, but I'm exaggerating here. So I'm conscious of the time. So I just want to take a few minutes just to touch on how to measure resilience. Again, so Jessica and I can share some of the tools that we think are useful, and some of you have shared as well some things. But then we'll provide additional details in the comments, or in the communications that will go out with the replay. So Jessica, I know you have a nice model to assess change. So it's called
change. Yeah.
Super.
I love frameworks because it helps me remember what I want to stay focused on. So Super is a measurement framework. It's satisfaction, utilization, proficiency, engagement, and then resilience is the final component. And I can send out a summary slide to the individuals on this call that just includes like what it is, what the KPI stands for, different metrics you can use. So as it relates to resilience, what you're measuring is the end user's experience, not engagement, but their experience with the change process. So what you have done as a change leader to facilitate the change, or I should say, and the outcomes of the change itself. So it's all about that experience. So I mentioned earlier how, measuring stress. What was their stress level during this change? What was their level of trust and commitment to the organization, to the leadership team during this change? And again, this is a very new space period for just thinking about how do we measure change performance, business performance, but this is a key component of where we need to go in order to be able to connect those dots of the resilience of employees was low. The change outcomes were less than, not as satisfactory, and the impact on the business as a result was this. Now, if resilience is high, what you're not only measuring is how the change experience was, but it's a predictor of future change performance. Because with that, they start to, resilient employees are able to bounce back. They understand the process. They're able to respond more positively and favorably to the next change. But what that means is there has to be a process in place that they can predict. It's the unknowns that throw people off. It's the change. If you have multiple teams within your entity, your organization, implementing change in different ways to the same stakeholders, it's really difficult for them to predict and expect, and know what to expect. And that creates stress because it creates unknowns. So by looking at, factoring in resilience, and having the same process, you're creating space for people to actually develop that resilience because you have a predictable process. You're creating those breaks. You're thinking about the end user's well-being. So that's kind of how it all ties together. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Jessica. I know we're trying to go quickly to just present your model. I just want to mention there's a few tools that, as I said, I will share after. I haven't personally developed any special model, but there are different assessments that you can refer to actually either use as is or just incorporate in your own, survey, as you said, because I think that's the basic, right? Having some sort of survey or metrics, to hear the experience from people who are experiencing the change. And so one of them I find is psychological safety assessment by Dr. Amy Edmondson. So if you wanted to tackle more this trust aspect, so if people feel safe, they'll be, in better position to embrace the change and participate. There's emotional agility from Susan David. There's a quiz that's available that you can do individually or as a team. So everybody can have a sense of how they, process their emotions and respond actually to stress and change. That's part of it. The Energy Project is also another company that has what we call energy audits. So it's more of like the 4 dimensions that I mentioned. And if you want to be more specific about resilience and having, the tools and tips and guidance that comes with it, Aura tool by Tanya Didovic. I'll share the details. She's developed a very nice framework and tool, so you can have the assessment and all the follow-up and the debrief on your own resilience assessment and tips and tricks after, not tricks, but tips and advice. But there's so many assessments, but these at the core of it is, measure how people, whether it's the ADKAR model from a change perspective, how ready they are. So readiness assessment, great, but incorporate as well their experience. I think we agree on this, Jessica. If you have a sense of their experience, you can actually adjust the change, and the better they feel and are able to process these, the better they'll respond and participate in change, and the less they'll resist.
You'll see that in the performance of the organization. So there's that.
Yeah, but that's all about this, right? At the end of the day, yeah. So on that, I thank everybody for joining this conversation. Thanks, Jessica, for participating today.
Thanks for having me.
Again, I'll make the replay available and let you all know, and you'll have all these additional details as well. If you want to stay around for another 20-25 minutes, we're just gonna stop the recording and just enjoy the chat between us. Thanks.